How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
It was never about democracy. It was never about human rights. It was always about imperialism and the neo-colonial drive for the control of Venezuela's resources. If Trump rubs the foreign policy establishment the wrong way, it isn't because he somehow represents a break with the logic of empire. It's because he has a tendency to say the quiet part out loud. At the end of May, Brazilian President Lula da Silva hosted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro for a bilateral meeting ahead of a regional summit in Brasilia. During their press conference, Lula said what anyone who actually follows Venezuela already knew. This idea that the country under Maduro is not a democracy, that the people live under an authoritarian nightmare and are enduring a human rights catastrophe, is a narrative, one crafted and amplified to justify imperialist attacks. It should come as no surprise that Lula received strong pushback for his comments. Political leaders such as Uruguay's Luis Lacalle and Chile's Gabriel Boric, along with pro-imperialist Human Rights Watch, criticized the Brazilian leader for daring to go against the narrative about Venezuela. Then along comes Trump to prove that Lula was right all along. The US-led sanctions campaign, the blockade of the oil industry, the effort to isolate Maduro internationally. It wasn't about restoring democracy. It was about turning the screws on the population. They wanted the country, as Trump said, to collapse in order to, quote, get all that oil. Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. On today's program, we're looking at the state of Venezuela's assets abroad. We open the program with Trump's recent comments about the country. Trump is a buffoon, of course, and woefully wrong about U.S. policy towards Venezuela today. As we've explored previously on this program, under President Joe Biden, U.S. policy has largely gone unchanged. The maximum pressure strategy, first implemented by Trump, has continued under Biden. Putting aside the absurd notion that Venezuelan oil sales are somehow lining Maduro's pockets, if that supply was interrupted, it is because of the U.S. blockade on Venezuela's oil industry. In fact, during Chávez's years as president and before the imposition of sanctions on the oil industry, the supply of oil from Venezuela to the U.S. was never in question. What the U.S. couldn't tolerate was that the rent from oil was spent on the people, that it was used to finance an alternative development model, one that tried to break free of U.S. domination. U.S. leaders on both sides of the aisle cannot stand the fact that their puppets aren't in charge in Venezuela. We can say with confidence that the era of the isolation of Venezuela and the democratically elected government of Nicolás Maduro is over. Country after country has abandoned the farce of the so-called interim government. That is, of course, with the exception of the imperialist countries, like the US, who are unwilling to admit their defeat. Instead, they double down, refusing to lift their illegal sanctions and delivering another $347 million worth of stolen Venezuelan funds to the long-defunct opposition-controlled National Assembly. The Trump-Biden maximum pressure strategy is about empire. Venezuela is being punished for daring to propose a counter-hegemonic vision. One of the ways the country is being punished is through the theft of the country's foreign assets. Presently, there is $2 billion worth of Venezuelan gold held in the Bank of England out of reach for the Maduro government, frozen because Downing Street still wants to pretend that Maduro is not the president. To talk about the status of Venezuela's gold in the UK and the efforts by the UK political establishment to deny government access to it, we will speak with investigative journalist John McEvoy. But first, a conversation with Venezuelanalysis Ricardo Vaz on U.S. efforts to keep the so-called interim government alive, its role as an instrument to facilitate the plunder of Venezuela's assets and resources, and the precarious situation of Venezuela's $10 billion worth U.S.-based oil subsidiary, CITGO. Hi, Ricardo. As always, it's great to have you back on the program here to share your insights with us. We're talking about Venezuelan assets. So I wanted to ask, obviously, about Juan Guaidó. So when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president in 2019, the expectation of his foreign backers, namely the United States, among others, was that the Venezuelan armed forces would quickly defect and join his unconstitutional coup. But I think Guaidó and the hardline opposition in Venezuela, as usual, underestimated their rivals. I think they underestimated the loyalty of the armed forces, and they underestimated the Venezuelan working class. Now, as our listeners know, the coup plot failed. And even his own allies, as of today, have withdrawn his fake status as the so called interim president. Yet every time you think that this charade is over, he somehow pops back up into the spotlight. After first cutting off the opposition's access to the money, something that I think for me is akin to a parent disciplining a misbehaved child. We saw that after Guaido arrived in the United States in early May, the State Department once again loosened the purse strings and gave the defunct 2015 National Assembly, led by Dino de la Figuera, access to $347 million in Venezuelan frozen funds. Now, I've taken to calling Guaido's circus a zombie government because it just refuses to die. Surely, even US policymakers have come around to the fact that Maduro is not going anywhere. So, why do they keep resurrecting this long expired, opposition controlled National Assembly, which doesn't have any legitimacy anymore?
Hi, Jose Luis. It's great to be here. I should apologize to the listeners. I have a bit of a flu going on, so I might sound a bit funky. So just a small detail to add to what you were saying in the beginning. You are absolutely correct that there was this expectation that the coup was going to succeed. I mean, we're not speculating. This was really what U.S. officials said, that it was going to succeed in a window of weeks, months at most. But when we talk about underestimating the loyalty and the Bolivarian character of the Venezuelan armed forces, as well as the resistance and the kind of anti-imperialist instincts of the Venezuelan people, this miscalculation or underestimation was also from US policymakers. I don't know if they were too happy to believe in the likes of Guaido, who promised them an early victory, but it was very clearly a miscalculation from them. And I really like the expression zombie government. I mean, this thing, which is far from serious, has been around for so long, and we've come up with so many names in time. One of the defining moments for me, and I know I've harped on this joke quite a lot, the defining moment for me of the Guaido quote unquote interim presidency is this press conference where there's a Venezuelan, a shield of the Venezuelan Republic that's made of cardboard, and it falls behind him as in this kind of pretend press set that he had. So you kind of went from a cardboard presidency to a zombie government, as you were saying. This National Assembly, I'm sure readers who follow Venezuelanalysis will be quite aware. This National Assembly, its term ran out in January 2021. So it is already over 2 years past its expiration date. And when we think about a parliament, I mean, this was elected, these deputies were elected by popular vote in 2015 to a 5-year term. It's not within their prerogative to just unilaterally extend their own term. So that's where kind of being backed by the US empire seems to change the rules. And when we wonder why is this defunct National Assembly still around, I mean, I think we have 347 million reasons. Actually, just before a few hours ago, I went to look at what this expired National Assembly is up to, because when Guaido was in charge, they took the charade very seriously. So they would hold these parliamentary sessions, quote unquote again, via Zoom, and they would have an agenda and all that. But ever since this National Assembly dissolved, the interim government appointed Dino de Figuera, as you were mentioning, as the new president, it seems that they no longer really care about keeping up appearances. So they don't even meet. The last meeting, which was just a meeting of a commission, was over a month ago. And they don't really care. I mean, they're just there to fulfill a role. So when we talk about these 347 million, these are Venezuelan assets that the US seized. And so having this zombie government, which we could also refer to as a kind of placeholder, it's something that the US, as you were saying, US policymakers surely know that this is not going to be successful, but it doesn't mean that it's no longer useful. So these 347 million follow hundreds of millions before, and these have been mechanisms for the United States to transfer resources to the Venezuelan opposition. Only that they're not even US taxpayer money, they are Venezuela's own money that's being transferred to the opposition. And it's no mystery why that happens. Right now, the opposition is having primary elections in October, and then there's a presidential race next year. We don't know the date yet. It should be towards the end of the year. So I firmly expect that this National Assembly is going to remain in place, because this will be the mechanism to fund, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, an electoral campaign to see if they can finally defeat Chavismo at the polls, which is something that they haven't really succeeded so far. So this is kind of the, let's say, more immediate short-term reason why this placeholder zombie government remains. And the other is that you mentioned in the beginning that Guaidó declared himself interim president in January 2019, and he was recognized by the US, and then all the usual suspects fell in line. John McEvoy is going to tell us about what that meant in the UK for Venezuela's gold reserves stored there. But in other cases, it just meant that Venezuela's assets abroad were transferred to the hands of this interim government with all the consequences that it had. And so this kind of alternative recognized entity remains in place to control the fate of these assets.
On the topic of Venezuelan foreign assets, in the second half of the program, we're going to look into the case of Venezuela's gold in the UK, which I think a lot of people are probably somewhat familiar with. But that's only one piece of a much larger picture. Right now, I'd like to focus on Venezuela's US-based oil subsidiary, CITGO, which is considered the country's most valuable foreign asset, worth somewhere between $9 and $15 billion. Our colleague at Venezuelanalysis, Andreina, recently wrote that, quote, "There's almost zero chance of the Venezuelan people ever getting them back," end quote, referring to Venezuela's foreign assets, CITGO included. So what happened with CITGO? And is Andreina right? Are they never going to get it back?
Sadly, I think Andreina might be right. I mean, we have covered CITGO quite extensively. I would invite readers to look at our coverage. We also have a neat infographic that details the very steps that took us to this point. So just to summarize, this is a very long and kind of technical field with legal intricacies. But the key thing is that CITGO is being threatened by creditors. So on one hand, there's a bond, the PDVSA 2020 bond, which defaulted. Venezuela, because of sanctions, could not continue to service this bond, even though it was a heavy priority for the Maduro government. And 50.1% of the shares of PDV Holding, which is the holding company of CITGO, were pledged as collateral. So these bondholders can seize them as compensation. They haven't done it so far because of an order by the US Treasury Department blocking any transactions with this specific bond. This order was put in place kind of spare the blushes of the quote unquote interim government, to make sure that CITGO was not lost on their watch. And this was usually renewed for a year, but after the Guaidó experiment came to its tragic end in January, it has only been renewed for 3-month periods. And the writing is kind of on the wall that at some point the protection is going to be lifted altogether. But this is just one part of the story. The other, which is much bigger, has to do with the number of corporations that won international arbitration awards against Venezuela. So as we recall, Chavez had a very clear sovereign perspective for what Venezuela's economy should be, and specifically the oil sector. And so the rules changed in a way that it wasn't such a paradise for foreign corporations anymore. So some of them actually adapted and stayed. I mean, we have the case of Chevron, which is still around, and others refused to play by the rules and try to, create some tension. And in the end, the Venezuelan government nationalized those assets. So then these corporations went to these international tribunals, in most of them to the ICSID, which is the tribunal under the purview of the World Bank. And these tribunals always, believe it or not, rule in favor of corporations. So there are a number of awards owed to these corporations. And Venezuela in the past has tried to reach settlements with them and agree to kind of favorable payment schedules to kind of solve these issues. And one of them, to get us to the present, was Crystal X. Crystal X is a Canadian miner which is no longer around. It's defunct, but it sued Venezuela for the expropriation of a mine. It was awarded something like $2 billion, including interest. And Venezuela reached a settlement with the company, and it was making some kind of 400 million payments. And then because of sanctions, it couldn't physically make the payment. And so Crystal X went to this kind of judicial route. And we shouldn't assume that the justice system in the US is impartial. So this really became another avenue to attack Venezuela. And so there was a judge in Delaware that granted Crystal X the right to seize CITGO shares as compensation. This is not trivial. You actually were the one who wrote about this most recently. There's the so-called alter ego argument, because these debts, these awards are owed by the Venezuelan state. And so it's not immediate for the creditor to claim shares of some state company as compensation. You have to prove that they are one and the same. And so Crystal X was able to prove that through the expertise, in a very loose sense, of a character who has played a very dark role in all of this, and that's José Ignacio Hernández. So he was kind of an expert witness to prove that Venezuela and PDVSA were the same, and thus Crystal X could seize CITGO shares as compensation. And then José Ignacio Hernández went to work for the Guaidó administration. And so to me, this screams conflict of interest. And it's even more surprising that having worked for Crystal X was not bothered at all that he went to the other side. And so when we talk about why CITGO is in danger, it's a combination of things. So on one hand, you have the justice system, both the US justice system and these kind of international tribunals that have a very clear bias in favor of corporations. On the other, you have sanctions which stop Venezuela from being able to deal with these issues in the most favorable conditions, call it like that. And then you have the actions of the opposition, which in some cases we can classify them as incompetence, but I think there are also very clear signs of collusion and conflicts of interest. I was talking about José Ignacio Hernández. Another case, perhaps the most outrageous of all, there's an award owed to ConocoPhillips, and this is something like 8.5 billion, and with interest, it's already over 10 billion. And this is still under appeal in this World Bank court. But while that was ongoing, ConocoPhillips went to a court, I think in Washington, D.C., asking for permission to enforce the award. And after more than a year, Guaido's lawyers, and remember, Guaidó, even though he didn't have any real power, he had these budgets of tens of millions of dollars. And Guaido's lawyers simply didn't show up in court, and ConocoPhillips won this ruling by default. So now it's also looking to enforce this award. And to make matters even murkier, one of the chief attorneys for ConocoPhillips is Alberto Ravel, who is none other than the son of Juan Guaidó's press chief. Of course, this is just circumstantial evidence, and there's no proof that there are conflicts of interest, but there are certainly very clear signs that they are at least should be investigated, and that the role of the opposition has not been at all to safeguard and protect Venezuelan assets, but rather to ensure that they're plundering, to use your own expression. So to go back to what Andreina was saying, if what Andreina wrote, if CITGO's fate is sealed or not. I think at this point it is, because there are so many creditors whose claims, if you add them up, surpass the valuation of CITGO, that it's very hard to see how it can remain more or less intact, especially if these kind of ugly signs of conflicts of interest and collusion are not going to be challenged judicially. It becomes even more complicated. So now you have a board at CITGO that was appointed by this expired National Assembly. So who does this board actually answer to? Because it's not automatic that they will have the best interests of CITGO in mind, and also what they think are the best interests are not necessarily what PDVSA thinks are the best interests, or what the best interests are for the Venezuelan country, for Venezuela, for the country. So now this board says that it's going to negotiate individually with creditors, but it doesn't have at least a moral authority to do so. It's just going to find some corporate arrangement that's good for everyone except for Venezuela. And it's going to be terrible, not just because of the 13 billion that CITGO is worth, but also because of what it's worth to the Venezuelan oil sector. So here we had a number of refineries very close to Venezuela, and they provided a perfect outlet for Venezuela's extra heavy crude. So when we talk about exporting crude to China, that's fine, but that's much further away. So it was actually much cheaper and much more favorable to have like a secure destination for your oil, which then in turn would send back fuel, kind of saving you the trouble of having to import fuel or having to struggle with the refining system. So it's not really just losing the asset and what it's valued. It's a lot, of course, but it also has bigger implications for the Venezuelan oil sector and the economy.
Yeah, I think the role of the opposition in the plunder of Venezuelan assets can't be overstated. It's clear, and I really appreciate the way you've outlined it for us. I've argued elsewhere that after the so-called interim government failed in its primary objective, which was to effect regime change in Venezuela, to oust Maduro, it actually transformed into something else. It became an instrument to facilitate the plunder of Venezuelan assets and resources. But at the same time, I suspect that there are also geopolitical interests at play. Because at the end of the day, the supply of oil from Venezuela to the United States was never interrupted. It wasn't about exacting control over the resources at a certain given point. But then, obviously, imperialism took these steps to dramatically intervene in the affairs of Venezuela, which we've talked about at length. So I wonder, when it comes to these geopolitical motivations, is U.S. imperialism trying to punish Venezuelans in order to send a message?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent way to read it. You have a number of objectives that are not mutually exclusive, but then, once the main goal of really replacing the government and installing a US friendly administration, once that is out of the window, what more can you do? I mean, thinking from the US standpoint, what more can you do to hurt Venezuela the most in the short run and in the long run? So the final thing you said, this idea of punishing Venezuelans for taking wrong choices and electing people like Chavez, the US has been trying to do this since the very beginning. But this final or this most recent stage of imperialist aggression against Venezuela is perhaps the closest they've come to actually oust the Bolivarian process. And, if you go back to what you were saying in the beginning, they didn't really come close at all. So it just shows how they continue to deal in this kind of imperialist delusion. So when we talk about CITGO, I think we have to see it as part of this wider sanctions program, to try and hurt the Venezuelan economy, to try and hurt the Venezuelan oil sector as much as possible with long-term consequences. So here, there might be a case where at some point, CITGO is returned to the Venezuelan government, but it's so riddled with debts and so compromised that it's actually worse for Venezuela. These are the kinds of scenarios that we're talking about. So when we consider something as strategic as oil, and especially given its importance in Venezuela, it is about trying to, being the US, did not succeed in ousting Maduro, but it's about weakening and hurting Venezuela as much as possible in the long run, so that, for example, it will have to return to the global oil markets in much less favorable conditions, in much more vulnerable conditions. I mentioned Chevron a while ago. There was, the only step that the Biden administration took with regards to this quote unquote maximum pressure sanctions program from the Trump administration, the only step they did to undo that was a very limited license for Chevron that has been in place for some 6 months now. And this is a license that attempts at every turn to stop the Venezuelan government, or the Venezuelan state rather, from getting the revenues that it is actually due to its majority stakeholding position in the ventures with Chevron. But because Venezuela is in such a vulnerable position and in such dire need of income, it's kind of forced to accept these less favorable conditions. So if the US is not going to succeed in introducing a puppet government, even if it's not going to succeed in winning the elections next year, there's nothing to suggest that the opposition is going to get its act together. It's going to at least make sure that Venezuela will become as weakened and as vulnerable and as dependent as possible, to use your own analogy, to kind of give a lesson to the Venezuelan people.
I think anybody who ever doubts that the US today is an empire need only look at the way it tries to distort the situation, to manage the situation in Venezuela. It's clear as day for me. It's neocolonial plunder. It is the logic of empire. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. As always, it's been really good hearing your analysis, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I hope this was insightful, and I hope everyone will enjoy it.
Eu fiquei sabendo que a Venezuela tinha uma reserva de 31 toneladas de ouro em Londres e que essa reserva de ouro, ao invés de ser colocado sob a guarda do governo da Venezuela, foi colocada sob a guarda do Guaidó.
In our next segment, we will speak with investigative journalist John McEvoy, who has extensively covered the issue of Venezuela's gold for the website Declassified UK. Hi, John. Welcome to the program. It's really great to have you here. My first question is this. The interim president is no more, dissolved by his own allies in the 2015 defunct National Assembly. But the biggest backers of the Guaidó circus, the US and the UK, they seem unable to let it go. During his visit to Washington, we saw Guaidó convince policymakers to release another $347 million to the opposition. And then meanwhile, in the UK, the Maduro government, to this date, cannot access its gold reserves there. Help us answer this question that you posed in one of your pieces for Declassified UK. Why is Venezuela's gold still frozen in the Bank of England?
Thanks very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. So I'll try and just go through the kind of history of how the situation that we're in today has come to be, how it is that 5-6 months almost to the day actually after Juan Guaidó was forced to step down and his parallel government was dissolved, how the gold in the Bank of England is still frozen, and as you say, the Venezuelan government is still not able to access it. So this came to public light really around March 2020 when the Venezuelan government sued the Bank of England over its refusal to release the gold. But the history actually goes back a couple of years prior. So the Bank of England initially refused to release Venezuela's gold, which widely reported to be worth around 1.2 billion. But the reality was, in fact, that they were worth roughly $2 billion worth. So the initial refusal came after the 2018 election in Venezuela. And the Bank of England initially refused to release the gold over apparent confusion over the legitimacy of the Maduro government. As everyone will be aware, shortly after on the 23rd of January 2019, Juan Guaidó declared himself president of Venezuela, and a number of countries, the the US kind of rushed to recognise him. I believe it was the same day or the day after. The British government gave the Maduro government a week to declare new free or fair elections, without which they would recognise Guaidó, which they did on the 4th of February. And this basically gave the Bank of England a much clearer legal basis to justify the freezing of Venezuela's gold. Former Foreign Office Minister for the Americas, Alan Duncan, kind of revealed in his diary that the Bank of England was actually quite concerned about the gold situation prior to the UK's recognition of Guaidó. They believed that they were on shaky ground, and that their case for freezing Venezuela's gold might not hold up in a court of law. So Duncan provided the Bank of England, prior to recognition, with a robust Foreign Office letter outlining the UK government's position on Venezuela. But really, the recognition of Guaidó served as the kind of core legal prerequisite for the freezing of the gold. So then we get to March or May 2020, when the Maduro government actually sues the Bank of England to release the gold, and this triggers this protracted legal battle, which is still ongoing today. And the whole legal battle is basically centred on whether the UK government recognises the Maduro government or recognises Guaidó. And if they do recognise Guaidó, whether that gives Guaidó the power, or Guaidó's representatives the power, to represent and control the assets of the Central Bank of Venezuela, which are situated in London, i.e. in the Bank of England. The court hearing the hearings which have passed through the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and also the Supreme Court have been. I mean, I don't have a legal background, but I've followed it as closely as perhaps anybody else, and it's centred on a number of different things. It initially centred on whether the UK really recognised Guaidó. The court initially found that yes, that the Foreign Secretary at the time, Jeremy Hunt's statement of recognition of Guaidó on the 4th of February 2019 acted as sufficient recognition, and therefore the executive and the judiciary must speak with one voice, and therefore the UK recognises Guaidó for all intents and purposes. Shortly after, at the Court of Appeals, this decision was appealed, and at the Court of Appeals, the Maduro government actually won, because the judge in this case found that, in fact, the UK government's recognition of Guaidó was ambiguous, given that there is a stated recognition of Guaidó, but the Maduro government still exercised de facto power, and the UK government still maintained diplomatic relations with the Maduro government. So, for example, the Maduro government had an ambassador in the UK that the UK government had to coordinate with if the UK government ever wanted to, have a diplomatic visit to Venezuela, for instance. So, for all intents and purposes, the UK government continued to recognise the Maduro government, but in verbal terms, it recognised the Guaido's parallel government. So the next phase of this, without getting too far into the legal mumbo jumbo, was that appeal was again overturned, and it was once again found that the UK government, in fact, did recognise Guaidó, and that the Foreign Secretary's written statement on recognition was sufficient evidence for the courts to assume that the UK government treats Guaidó as president. And then the issue moved on to whether, okay, so if the UK government does recognise Guaidó as Venezuelan president, does Guaidó therefore have a sufficient legal basis to represent and control the Central Bank of Venezuela's assets in the UK? And can the UK courts recognise the decisions of Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice, its highest court, which nullified the appointments of Guaidó to the Central Bank of Venezuela, what is called his ad hoc board of the Central Bank of Venezuela? This is a sticking point that the courts are still discussing, and there was a hearing just this week where the Maduro board was basically trying to appeal the UK court's statement that yes, that the Guaido board was able to basically that the TSJ was the STJ was incapable of nullifying his appointments. There's been a number of absurdities, and it's been driven by farces, this entire process. There's two examples to bring up. The first of which is when the Maduro government actually won its appeal, the Guaido board was forced to pay £400,000 of court fees to Maduro board. But since the Maduro board was actually under sanctions from the US government, it wasn't legally possible for the Guaido board to pay its court dues. And so the Guaido board risked being held and was actually held in contempt of court for its failure to pay dues to the court because of the sanctions under place against the Maduro board. The other absurdity is that the hearing that happened this week, because the case is still ongoing despite Guaido no longer being president, is that they've turned up to court, and the argument has moved so far away from the original legal dispute that the people representing Guaido's initial ad hoc board of the Central Bank of Venezuela are no longer even the same people, because the Guaido government no longer exists. So the entire case has moved so much further than how it originated, and that it simply comes across as farcical. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Foreign Office at this point would happily just be done with it, because it is a real enduring embarrassment for the UK government.
Yeah, and that actually brings me to my next question. The way you describe it, they've tried to sell us this idea that it's just a court case, that it's something for the Bank of England to resolve. But the truth is, it's political. And one of the other pieces you worked on for Declassified UK talked about this. Not only has the Venezuelan gold case exposed how Venezuela's opposition has tried to seize Venezuelan state assets with looted Venezuelan state assets, but it turns out that the UK put tens of thousands of pounds towards Guaido's efforts to access this $2 billion worth of gold. And so your latest investigation found that the Foreign Office spent public funds, that is, funds belonging to the people of the UK, to support Guaido's campaign. How did you get this information? How did you find out that it turns out there was funding from the British Foreign Office? And what does this tell us about the political nature of this case of the Venezuelan gold in the UK banks?
Yeah, exactly. So since 2019, in fact, the UK Foreign Office, as well as the UK Treasury, or officials representing both departments, have insisted on a number of occasions that this isn't a political case, that this is either a matter for the Bank of England or a matter for the courts. And this is a kind of typically insincere argument on the part of the UK government. Because as I mentioned earlier, obviously this case would not actually need to exist if the UK government had not made the absurd decision to recognise Guaido in the first place. So a political decision actually triggered this protracted legal battle in the first place. But there are other layers of politicisation of this case as well. As John Bolton laid out in his book, Jeremy Hunt visited Washington shortly after Juan Guaido's self-proclamation in late January 2019. And Venezuela was high on the agenda. They discussed it together. Documents I've received via the Freedom of Information Act show that both Mike Pompeo, the then Trump Secretary of State, and John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, both thanked Jeremy Hunt for his position on Venezuela, for going one step towards recognition of Guaido. But the book also shows that Hunt was delighted to agree to freeze Venezuela's assets in London. So obviously, this clearly shows that you cannot decontextualize the freezing of Venezuela's assets from the wider political situation, whereby the US principally is trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. But as you touched on, more recently, I published an article demonstrating that the Foreign Office had spent upwards of £80,000 on this case. So the Foreign Office has, on numerous occasions during the Bank of England gold legal dispute, been either called upon or voluntarily provided information to the courts in order to promote or in order to support Juan Guaidó's claim to the gold. So at every turn throughout this case, the Foreign Office has emphasized to the courts that it recognizes Juan Guaidó and not Nicolas Maduro as Venezuelan president. And particularly with regards to the Supreme Court hearing, the Foreign Office acquired the legal services of some of the UK's top lawyers in order to basically describe the Foreign Secretary's position on recognition. So the Foreign Office has basically used, public money in order to emphasise its case at the Supreme Court and at other hearings in order to support Juan Guaidó's claim to the gold. Obviously, this is a scandalous and ridiculous use of public funds, and the UK government was not at all required to acquire the best legal service it could possibly find, and at no point has it been actually required to justify Guaidó's claim to the court, because at any time during this entire process, the UK government could have stepped down from its ridiculous position, normalised relations with the Maduro government, and accepted that its recognition of Guaidó in the first place had no sound legal basis, was an infringement of the sovereignty of the Venezuelan state, and also, this is going a step further than what you would expect of the British government, but accept that the sanctions regime against Venezuela is causing harm to ordinary Venezuelans. But then again, this is not necessarily out of the question. There's a number of past cases of British foreign policy in Latin America, which show that the British government actually did recognise that sanctions harm the civilian population more than they actually serve the foreign policy goals at the time. And one of the key examples of this is during the late 80s, when the US government imposed really harsh sanctions on Panama to try and get rid of Noriega, who, as you'll know, was on the CIA payroll for many years, but the US government by this time had turned on him. And at this time, the British government opposed sanctions on Panama. They said that this is going to harm. They rightfully said that this is going to harm the ordinary civilian population. It's not going to help the US government succeed in its foreign policy objectives of removing Noriega. And so they declined to do so. Similarly, following the Cuban Revolution, the British government refused to join the wholesale embargo on Cuba because it recognised that this was an unjust act of economic warfare. But in the case of Venezuela, this position has eroded. Perhaps this is related to Britain's global decline more widely, that it no longer has the kind of ability to resist US pressure to join these kind of economic embargoes. But it's clear that in British thinking, they're capable of understanding that these kinds of embargoes and sanctions harm the civilian population and don't have the supposed intended effect of removing the government. So to go back to the very start, the freezing of Venezuela's gold has to be understood within the wider context of the US-backed effort to remove the Maduro government. This is political at its core. It is influenced by the US government, and the Foreign Office's use of public funds to support this claim is scandalous.
Yeah, I want to close precisely with a conversation about the impact of Western policy towards Venezuela, about the impact of sanctions. And we know that the aim of the whole interim government charade was regime change. They wanted a change in Caracas. But when it became clear that their coup plot wasn't going to pan out, it seems to me that there was a shift in their strategy and that the interim government became an instrument to facilitate the plunder of Venezuela's assets and resources as part of this broader policy towards the country, pursuing regime change, increasing the suffering, pressuring the Maduro government. We have the case of the gold that we were just talking about, but we also have the case of Monomeros and CITGO, which were similarly handed over to the opposition. Monomeros is in a really precarious situation. It was left in a really rough state. And CITGO, which is Venezuela's most prized foreign asset, is likely to be broken up and seized by US courts in order to comply with some arbitration awards. But it seems most people in the US, in the UK, they don't fully understand the impact of Western policy towards Venezuela. They don't understand the impact of sanctions, of seizing assets. What does this situation, this reality that people are unaware of, say about the mainstream media's coverage? What role have the media played in facilitating the plunder of Venezuela?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I suppose there's two key studies that I've used to kind of elaborate on the mainstream media's awful coverage of the impact of sanctions on Venezuela. And the first was a CEPR, Centre for Economic Policy Research study, which found that roughly 40,000 Venezuelans had been killed as a direct consequence of the international sanctions regime against the country over the span of just 1 year. The former UN Special Rapporteur, Alfred Zayas, similarly estimated that roughly 100,000 Venezuelans had died as a direct result of the sanctions regime. But particularly related to the CPR study, which was, a really in-depth, really impressive study. And, CPR is a kind of a respected international research agency. Totally ignored. I don't think one mainstream media organisation picked up this study, because, of course, the mainstream media is complicit in the sanctions regime against Venezuela. Every single time that the mainstream media reports on the internal economic and political situation in Venezuela and refers to the very real human suffering of Venezuelans and doesn't refer to the sanctions regime, well, they're guilty of a dereliction of duty as journalists to inform the public about what is contributing to the difficult humanitarian situation in the country. The other key study that was also totally ignored across the corporate media was that of the UN Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures, i.e. sanctions, which, bear in mind, are seen as a war crime. Unilateral coercive measures that go beyond the remit of the United Nations and international bodies like the OAS are seen as war crimes, and they are seen as collective punishment against civilian populations. And that's worth bearing in mind in this discussion about how serious sanctions, unilateral sanctions, really are. But the UN Special Rapporteur, Alina Duhan, I believe in February 2021, found that the national income, Venezuela's national gross income, had declined by 99% of what it was on pre-sanctions. So the national income is 1% of what it had pre-sanctions. And that is an incredible statistic. And on top of that, Duhan urged the various banks, particularly the various European banks, including the Bank of England, to release Venezuela's state assets so that it could adequately respond to the various humanitarian and, at the time, medical issues, given the context of the COVID pandemic. And this was ignored by the UK government, but it was also totally ignored by the entirety of the UK corporate media. And I wrote an article about this in Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting Fair. So yeah, that's the role of the UK media, and that's the role of and that's the impact of the sanctions as well. But I wanted to briefly talk about the money that, as you mentioned, in the US, the money that was transferred from a Citibank account belonging to the Venezuelan state and transferred via the Federal Bureau of New York directly to the coffers of the parallel Juan Guaidó government. And the Juan Guaidó parallel government, the interim government, whatever you want to call it, was given $342 million of Venezuelan state assets, and it used these state assets in order to basically topple the state, and in order to seize more assets. So all of the Guaido's board legal fees throughout this entire Bank of England case have been paid with money that was initially appropriated from the Venezuelan state in the US. So this is kind of an incredible chain of looting. You know, the Guaido board has managed to loot money in the US and is using that to loot more money in the UK. And you know, if they had managed to get their hands on the gold in the UK, you can imagine that they would have used that money to loot even more Venezuelan state assets elsewhere. So that's why this case is so really important, because the UK government was prepared to transfer state assets to hostile actors engaged in regime change in that very same state. And so that's the importance for Venezuelans. The importance for Britons is that the Bank of England can no longer be seen by foreign states as a safe place to keep gold reserves. Any foreign state that severs or has difficult diplomatic relations with the UK will think of this case and think, well, we need to remove our state assets from the UK, from London immediately, because there is a possibility that the UK government will arbitrarily recognise an opposition political figure and then attempt to transfer the state's assets to that figure, which would allow them to engage more strongly in regime change. So that's the kind of political impact for Britain. So it's both. Venezuelans are definitely, you know, the chief victims of this ridiculous British policy, but there's also a blowback effect for people in Britain.
Yeah, it's a terrible precedent, no matter which way you look at it. I want to thank you so much for helping shine some light on this issue. I think it's something that has frankly been covered very poorly, but has so many implications. I really appreciate your analysis on this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And yes, support Venezuelanalysis as well.
That's our program for today. For more on the issues explored today, check out our dispatch on efforts to bury the Monroe Doctrine, episode 13 on solidarity versus sanctions, and episode 1 on the deadly impact of U.S. sanctions. Be sure to visit us at Venezuelanalysis.com for regular news and analysis on all things Venezuela. We'll end today's episode with the song Mi Patria Soberana by Armando Martínez.
Diamante viaja conmigo por los caminos, viaja conmigo diamante. Es que yo quiero enseñarte algunas partes de mi patria soberana. Es en Caicara donde se baila el joropo, Puerto Ayacucho es hermoso, usted lo sabe, compay. La brisa de Puerto Páez peinan a las colombianas, lo dice Marcelo Quinto, porque tenía 100 y pico y todas son complacientes. Capute es siempre el centro de Venezuela, la geografía no se vela, y tengo mi llanerita, es testigo Santa Rita de lo tanto que la amo, y en las Mercedes del Llano hay cantar y un mano a mano con mi compadre Ángel Ávila. Quiero ir a San Fernando, pero primero tengo que escuchar una arpa. Allá en La Pascua tocada por Benjamín, Palminio le puso fin a un contrapunto de Armando. Carlos Rondo va cantando un pasaje de marino, de esos que matan guayabo. Tito Camerú a caballo viene silbando un gabán. En Paniagua los Núñez son parranderos, Manuel Serrano el coplero canta con Santos Lozano, José Vicente mi hermano y el paisano Andrés García son gallos de pura casta. Hoy le dedico mi canta al doctor José María.